Hello, everyone. Well, thank you all for joining today. We're going to continue our discussion on extraordinary biblical women, and today we are going to begin to think about and to reflect upon what we know about Sarah from the book of Genesis. Sarah obviously was the wife of Abraham. And one thing that we want to consider as we're looking at these extraordinary biblical women, we're going to look at Sarah this week and next week, is that the same thing as we do when we look at everybody. We oftentimes get this idea in our head because somebody was in the Bible that make them some sort of almost demigod type character, that they could do very little wrong, and God chose them and to do the things that He wanted them to do because they were such wonderful people and barely sinned or anything like that. And that's just simply not the case. We don't see anything like that when we look at these different people that are in the scripture. And Sarah is certainly the same way. Sarah has a lot of issues that she, like us, had to deal with in her life. She was just she's just a regular human being. Um, as you're going through the scriptures, when you read about Sarah, you might pick up a few of those things that she had to deal with. She was oftentimes impatient with her husband, impatient with her maidservant Hagar. Um, she was temperamental. She was manipulative, which we see on a couple of different occasions. And sometimes she was pretty unreasonable. Um, all of us have probably done some of those things, if not all of them, and maybe even do them often. Her name, which was given at birth, is subtly different than the name that God had changed it to when she was much older. Her name given at birth is probably pronounced something like Sarai, which means my princess. God changed it to Sarah, which just simply means princess. He didn't change her name until she was 90 years old. Some have thought that maybe when her father, Terah, had given her this name, that this would lead her to being spoiled, and that could be the way maybe she was raised and treated. I don't know. We're not given any information too much um, on her younger life. In fact, the only thing that we know about her uh, growing up was that she is the half brother of Abraham. Um, Terah was both Abraham's father and Sarah's father. We don't know the names of their mothers, either Abraham's mother or Sarah's mother. They were half brother and half sisters that shared the same father, and we only know that Sarah was unable to have children. That's the only two things that we really know about Sarah, or the only few things that we know about Sarah. Most of those we just have to pick up by reading in between the lines um, of what the scriptures are teaching. So, not a lot of information there. We don't really pick up her story until she is 65 years old. Um, but the Bible does in the New Testament, even though despite all of the things that she had to deal with, the impatience, the temperamentalness, the unreasonableness, sometimes being manipulative, sometimes, and there's other things that we could have said. Um, Despite all of those, the most encouraging thing is found in Hebrews chapter 11. I believe it's in verse 11, when she is commended for her faith. And that should tell us something, that all of us, we deal with things. We've got to struggle with our bad attitudes and our sin and different things like that, and yet we can still have faith despite those things, and God's still working on us and in us, and it's going to take a lifetime. Um, So we are encouraged when we see things like that. Realize that God is not for us, but He's against us, and He's willing to work with us because of His abounding grace and His great love. She grew up in Ur, and as we already said, we learned in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 12 that Terah is both Abraham and Sarah's father. And what we also see, people will say, well, people bring this up every once in a while. It comes along with the territory when it comes to things like where did Cain get his wife and things like that. In our time, and it has been this way for a long time, you don't marry your sister. It's not lawful to marry your sister or close relatives. But that didn't become a law until Leviticus chapter 18 and verses 6 through 18. And then it's repeated over in Deuteronomy chapter 20, 17 through 21. Abraham is several hundred years, about 400 years prior to the law. So it's not fair to judge Abraham and Sarah based upon that. Also, when it comes to the genetic abnormalities that those who are involved in marrying their siblings or their close relatives, incest, we don't start seeing that till later after the human race was created, because there's not any genetic mutations that we have to deal with for several more generations, because the gene pool was pure, and it took a while to disrupt that purity, a couple thousand years at least. Anyway, as we said earlier, the biblical account is nearly silent on their early lives. Sarah was 65 when she enters into the biblical narrative, making Abraham 75. He's 10 years older than she is. They were both born and raised in Sumeria. So if you remember your ancient history, Sumeria is known as the cradle of life. It is the first civilization that we are aware of following the flood. And of course, that's where history begins to pick up. Everything before that is known as prehistory. But history begins to pick up in Sumeria. So Abraham comes straight from the cradle of civilization itself. And the city of Ur is primarily about where the Tigris River and the Euphrates River meet. So we're looking at the Persian, the head of the Persian Gulf there, and what we now know as Iraq. Also, if you go back to Genesis, when God creates the Garden of Eden, it's in about the same location. So, Garden of Eden was there in the Middle East, around those rivers that is referred to in Genesis chapter 2. Abraham was a contemporary of Nimrod, who would have been the king of Babylon. Nimrod we read about in Genesis chapter 11. There's actually some other stories that go along with this that we don't read inside the Bible that the Jewish people have held in their legends. They have those as well outside of Scripture. Some of them may be just like our legends. Sometimes they may be true, sometimes they may not be true. If it's not in the Bible, we don't really have any way of knowing for sure. But there are some legends and stories about Abraham and Nimrod. Remember, Nimrod was called a mighty hunter in Genesis 11. A couple of interesting things about Nimrod: he was the builder of Babylon and Nineveh, two cities that were very important in Israel's history. You remember, Babylon will take the southern kingdom of Judah captive, and that'll happen starting around 606 BC. And there will be different waves of captivity for the next 20 years. Prior to that, the city of Nineveh, which is the capital of the empire of Assyria later on, will destroy the northern tribes of Israel, in about 721 BC. And also, it's implied that Nineveh, or not Nineveh, but rather, so they lived in Ur, and Ur was an idolatrous city. In fact, they worshipped the moon god. It was the god that was supposed to protect their city. Apparently, however, Abraham and his family worshipped the Lord, and had always worshipped the Lord, though there are some who think that maybe in Joshua says to follow the gods or worship the gods that our fathers worshiped beyond the river. There in Joshua chapter 24, he's referring to Abraham. That actually probably is not the case. He's probably talking more along the lines of their fathers that were in Egypt, and probably specifically he may have been referring to the different idolatrous events while they were in the wilderness. So apparently most people believe that Abraham and his family worshiped the Lord. And we know that there was always a small remnant of people who did worship God and serve him. In fact, Abraham was only ninth in the line from Shem, from the flood. And of course, Noah had two other boys. You had Japheth, who goes north into Europe, and we don't see much out of Japheth's descendants. But you also have Ham, who goes into Africa and shares the Middle East with the descendants of Shem. And so Abraham is actually ninth from the line of Shem. Apparently his was the family that continued to serve God, at least a portion of them did, similar to the line of Seth that led up to Noah, as we read about there in Genesis chapter 5. We will run into Melchizedek, who also is a servant of God, and then later, much later, in Moses' time, we'll run into Jethro, the high priest of Midian, who actually is apparently a descendant of Abraham through Keturah. Anyhow, that's the first two sections that we're going to look at this evening about Sarah. We'll talk about Sarah just as she had foibles, but she just like us, but also just like us, she was a mixed bag, and she was a person of faith that was commended for her faith in the New Testament. And then, of course, we just got done discussing her life in Ur. So now we're going to conclude our study this evening by talking about her journey to Canaan. At some point before all of this began taking place, Abram at that time, was called already. We don't know when that call would have been, but we do know that God called him to leave Ur, and at that point, his father Terah, however you want to pronounce that, was still alive, and they began to leave. Terah was actually still the head of the household. They get stuck in a city known as Haran or Haran for a good while. This was Haran was about 700 miles northwest from Ur, and of course, we also read about Lot's father dying, and this is when Abraham begins to raise Lot, we assume, and they stay in Haran. In fact, that was also the name of the brother that passed. They stay in Haran for several years. We really don't know how long they stayed there, but it was for a good while. For whatever reason, maybe Terah had fallen ill, but he does live to the ripe old age of 200, which is 25 years longer than his son Abraham would live. Now, at the age that most of us consider to be retirement, at 65, Sarah sets out again with her husband Abraham, who had once again been called to keep going west to the land of Canaan. And so already they had moved from Ur, where they lived in a house, and then they moved to Haran, where they lived in a house. But now they are heading towards Canaan, which is several hundred more miles to the west, where they're going to be nomads within the land. There is no hint that Sarah hesitated or complained about any of this. In fact, it seems that she was ready to get back on the road and to do that which God wanted them to do. This displays that she had faith in the promise that God had given to Abraham, and she believed in what God had to say. But there were challenges, and that's what happens all the time with everybody. With Abraham had many challenges, not just those within his own heart and soul, um, but he had challenges that he had to deal with everyday things of life. Just like us, we have to struggle with things. Sarah had to struggle with these, obviously. We have to struggle with things within ourselves, within our souls and our hearts, sin, guilt, all kinds of things. And then, of course, we also have all kinds of uh, different occurrences all around us that we have to deal with and struggle with. And we could name several that we're dealing with right now. It was the same with Abraham. Um, as he was heading there, there's a famine that arises. There were a lot of famines during that time. There's some pretty good studies out as to why there were so many famines. It could have been leftover problems from the worldwide flood. The earth was still dealing with a lot of struggles. In fact, one could still say even thousands of years after the flood has taken place, there may be still some things lingering with our climate and with the structure of different things when it comes to different events, natural events that may be left over from the flood. The famines could have also been a result of a volcanic eruption on the other side of the planet. There was, we do now know that there was a great eruption over in the Western Hemisphere. Volcanic eruptions, when they are that large, do not just affect the area around them, but also affect the entire planet. Certainly, there have been times in the past, in the fairly recent past, that volcanoes erupting disrupt the natural flow of Earth's climate and planting seasons. Back in the 1700s, it was there was a large volcanic explosion that sent us into a winter in July, and it was a couple years before things started getting back to normal. Anyway, there's some pretty good information and some pretty good evidence to suggest that might have been the reason that there were so many famines in the days of the patriarchs and leading, even going past them. But Abraham had to go south. He and his wife were forced to go south, and of course, not just the two of them, but they packed up their entire family and their servants and all of their belongings, and they went south to Egypt. And of course, in Egypt, Sarah was looked upon as very beautiful, and Abraham was afraid of this, so he asked Sarah to say that he was her brother rather than husband, and that they were husband and wife, because he was afraid that Pharaoh would kill him, so that he could have Sarah as his wife. Now, we might think for a second, well, why did Sarah agree to that kind of thing? We don't have all the information. We don't have the dialogue between Sarah and Abraham. But what we do know is Sarah followed her husband's lead. She was submissive to him even in this, and she'll do it at least one. She'll do it at least one more time that we know of. Certainly, hopefully there was no more times that this took place, but she did this at least one more time. And the next one would be with the Philistines. Now, at this point, when Sarah is pointed out to Abraham, or not to Abraham, but to Pharaoh rather, he collects her and sends gifts to Abraham, which would have been understood as bridal gifts. So this is the way they did things back then. Maybe they even still do in some cultures. If you wanted to marry someone's daughter, or maybe the brother was the head of the home, then you would send bridal gifts and a bridal price. And so it appears that Pharaoh planned to marry Sarah, However, we also see a foreshadowing of what is to come later when Moses goes back into Egypt, because God protects Sarah and Abraham, protects Sarah from being married into Pharaoh's harem by sending plagues upon the Egyptians. So that, the 10 plagues is not the first time that Egypt runs into plagues from God. However, at this point, and leading up to Joseph and a little bit beyond, not the pharaohs were pretty reasonable people. Egypt was a pretty reasonable nation. Once Pharaoh sees what's going on, he sends Abraham on his way with his wife Sarah, and Abraham was able to keep the gifts, and therefore he became even richer. So what we see here is Abraham is blessed by God in many ways, and a lot of times we get focused on the external things. Abraham was blessed with riches and became very wealthy. He'll become even wealthier as time goes on. But what Abraham did here was wrong, and yet he still had riches. Now, here's the thing we have to be careful with, because we're so attached to the externals. We oftentimes think that God is always blessing us with those things, where He can take them and make them blessings. Sometimes people will get external blessings through improper means, and this is what happened with Abraham. God was not blessing Abraham this way. Abraham simply got lucky here, but God blessed him in other ways, and He blessed him by providing for Abraham and Sarah, provided for their escape, made sure that Sarah's name was not sullied, that Abraham's name was not sullied and dragged through the mud throughout history. God preserved that name for them by protecting them. And here we see, and this is what we need to remember, because the Bible is about God, it's not about the people who are in it. God protects His people even when His people do silly things. God provides for His people even when His people act more in fear than they do in faith, because that's who God is. And God bestows His abundant grace upon us. That's all we're going to talk about this evening. We're going to go in deeper next week in this series about Sarah. But I appreciate everyone who took the time to listen, and I hope you all stay well, and we will see you soon. Bye bye.